Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us in the world today. And welcome to another episode of the Realist Lens for researchers who keep it real. Realist evaluation and synthesis have several features that make them stand out from other research approaches, from their unique perspective on how the world works to their theory driven and explanatory nature. But one of the most distinctive aspects of realist research is the way it uses reasoning and theorizing, particularly what's known as retroduction. For many students, early career researchers, or those new to realist approaches, this term can raise questions. What exactly is retroduction? How is it connected to realist thinking? And how can it help us understand the real world and generate useful insights? In today's episodes, we explore these questions in depth: what retroduction really means, how to use it, and why it matters for our work as realist researchers. Joining me is someone who brings a wealth of experience in realist approaches, training, theory, and publish. And I'm very happy to welcome who else but Justin Jagosh to the Realist Lens. Justin, great to see you. How are you?
I'm fine, Alejandro, and thank you for the invitation.
No problem at all. And I'm really looking forward to hear your thoughts and ideas when it comes to retroduction. Just before we get started, though, for those individuals who may be starting in the realist journey or just coming to this podcast initially, would you mind just sharing a little bit more about yourself and your work in the realist community so far?
Yeah, sure. So I am the director for the Center for Advancement in Realist Evaluation and Synthesis, which is essentially a consultancy which provides research services, specifically realist methodology research services to the wider research community. And that most of that comes in the form of training. So I run training workshops online most months of the year ongoing, and I've been doing this consistently since 2014. And I'm also involved in a number of projects using realist methodology as a co-investigator and or collaborator. And I have a mentorship program for PhD students, and I run an annual summer school, and many other things. But the point is, my whole professional career is dedicated to realist methodology. It's something I'm very interested in, and it's really nice to be able to meet lots of interesting people doing research where we're tasked with the challenge of applying realist thinking to diverse areas of inquiry. So that's essentially me. Probably that's all you need to know for now.
I love that, Justin. Thank you so much. And can I just give a shout out to your training as well? Because I've already been to two, and we've met in person as well, which was lovely to see
Yeah,
you in
yeah.
Bristol when you came. And I absolutely loved the training and the learnings that you take from it, and how practical it is as well. And I really love that area that you say there at the end, Justin, around the challenge of realist thinking and that complexity that comes with realist thinking, and going deeper into those processes that may be causing what we observe. And one of those processes, one of those ways of thinking in realist terms, is what we mentioned at the start, and the topic of this episode, which is retroduction, which is often described as a core feature of realist reasoning, realist research. But for people who are new to the realist world, or even who may be going from another lens or another way of doing research to doing realist research, they might find the concept slightly abstract or confusing. So, drawing on your own experience and the work that you've been doing, how would you explain what retroduction is and why it matters?
Well, the good news is retroduction has a very simple definition, and the rest is all detail. So that simple definition is that retroduction is explanatory inference. It's anytime you apply your thinking or putting your research cap on to ask the how question and the why question around a research topic. With working in realist evaluation, most people that use realist evaluation are evaluating a program or a class of programs. And so retroductive thinking is basically asking, how does this program work? For whom does it work? Why does it work? Even the for whom question has a underpinning why. If it works differently for some groups and not others, why is that? So we're always asking the how and the why questions in with retroductive inference, and that is characteristic of realist thinking and is characteristic of realist methodology. Pawson and Tilley. So if you read Pawson and Tilley, the originators of realist evaluation, their 1997 book, and even Pawson's 2006 book, there's no mention of retroduction. Retroduction has come from it comes from critical realism, although there is a history to the concept even predating modern critical realism. But critical realists talk about retroduction in a very active way, a very explicit, formal way. And so when I started going to critical realist conferences about 10, 12 years ago, I started hearing this term that I had never heard before. And so I looked it up and I started researching it, and I realized that, hey, this needs to be more explicitly stated for realist evaluation. That's why in 2020 I wrote that paper, Retroductive Theorizing in Pawson and Tilley's Scientific Realism, because I wanted to clarify that we already know retroduction is well established in critical realism, but we need to also establish it. I mean, let's face it, it's already established in practice. We just didn't name it. So all that time of realist evaluation from the 90s onwards, it is retroductive, but there wasn't, a name to it. And I thought it was important to name it. And so, yeah, that's how I would describe it in basic terms. It's explanatory.
I love that, Justin. And again, those two words, the how and why, encapsulates that so much to go beyond the surface and trying to explain what's being observed into why something is working or indeed not working in that intervention or phenomena. And you mentioned as well that you wanted to be very explicit and specific around, retroductive theorizing in Pawson and Tilley's realist evaluation and synthesis. What is it about retroduction and the learning and the research that you did that made you want to be explicit in that sense? Because people were doing it, but what was your main motivation to bring it to make it more explicit, as we
Mhm.
mentioned, and to be something that people should be talking about more often in this research?
Well, I think as a trainer of the approach, I needed more concepts and language to explain what realist methodology is. And so I think instantly people can grasp the approach when thinking about explanatory inference. Pawson and Tilley have that very useful quip, what works for whom under what circumstances and how. And that's just basically another way of thinking about what retroduction is. But retroduction really spells out, see, when you break down that term retroduction, like, in common parlance, when we use the word retro, we think of like the past, like what happened before, or retro fashion. In the 70s, it was bell bottoms and butterfly collars and so on. And so we have this idea that retro is something of the past. So but retroduction could either mean what came before that explains what currently is, or what's underpinning the current phenomenon. So, the realist philosophy has this concept of ontological depth. And I think maybe you've spoken about this with other guests on your podcast. So, this concept of ontological depth means that there are deeper mechanisms that are explaining the manifestation of the actual empirical world that we see. So retro in that sense is to go back from below or behind. That's in the definition, to go back from below or behind the observed patterns to discover what produces them. In other words, to discover the mechanisms that produce them. And so that's the origin of the word. So bringing that word into the realist evaluation community of practice, I think is just another way of reinforcing the what works for whom under what circumstances logic.
Yeah, I love that, Justin, because again, I think that makes it clearer, particularly for individuals who are going into the approach and they're learning about it, or indeed transferring as well. There's a lot of people that maybe have been doing more positivist kind of work, and they want to understand this way of reasoning in a little bit more detail. And going into that, because there will be some people that are potentially coming from other areas of research, so from more positivist research and constructivist research, that we explain those terms in this in episode 2 in ontology and epistemology. And in those areas of research, there's these two words like inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning that happens, right? And those are words that are used more in research, that people understand that process a little bit more. But when it comes to retroduction, how does that differ from these two other approaches in those two areas, inductive and deductive reasoning? And what does that difference mean in how we approach the data?
Good question. So, yeah, so you have these three terms, right? Induction, retroduction, deduction. Retroduction sits apart from induction and deduction in the sort of characteristics the of the process by which you engage. And in fact, so if you think in very simple terms that deduction is theory testing and induction is theory gleaning, then most research has some induction and deduction in the process. We tend to think that constructivist qualitative research leans more heavily on inductive approaches, like grounded theory is an example of a very inductive approach to analyzing data. So you have qualitative interviews and you organize the interview content according to themes that emerge from the data, right? And then alternatively, you have deductive theory testing, which is sorry, about theory testing and in positivistic research, which often takes the shape of quantitative research, you might have a theory at the outset that you seek to test, right? So you have a theory, you seek to test it, so you construct your experiment to then test your theory. But here's the thing, that there's no guarantee that your inductive or your deductive processes will be retroductive. In other words, there's no guarantee that your inductive or deductive processes will be explanatory. And there are many positivistic type hypotheses that get posed at the start of a say a randomized controlled trial, which basically declare that the authors or the researchers they assume the theory is that we expect that this intervention will achieve these outcomes. That's the theory. That's a theory testing approach. You start with that theory and then you proceed to test, but it's not explanatory. Because to say this intervention will result in these outcomes is I mean it's useful maybe to conceptualize your outcomes, but it's not explanatory to the mechanisms. It's not explaining, well, how will it do that, for whom will it do that. Similarly, on the other side you have induction, and if you theory glean, even grounded theory, there's no guarantee that that will be a causal focus. You might organize your data into themes and patterns. That's not just de facto a causal way of working. So the sort of coming to you kind of a clear answer to your question, that you can merge deductive reasoning with retroductive inference. You can merge inductive process with retroductive inference. In other words, make it explanatory. Make your initial theories explanatory. And when you inductively derive ideas from the data, prioritize the how and the why question in every instance. And that's how you can merge induction with retroduction. So does that make sense to you? Does that make sense to you? Yeah.
Certainly,
Yeah.
Justin. I love
Yeah.
that. And again, it's the intention that you're doing that, and the final outcome of that explanation, and to get into the deeper areas, and those mechanisms, hidden mechanisms that you're trying to see. And going into that deeper area, I want to just touch on that because in previous episodes we have mentioned your iceberg, and the
Mhm.
iceberg metaphor that you utilize. And I would love to hear more on your thoughts of using that metaphor to explain as well retroductive reasoning, and how in those layers of what's going on in reality, retroductive reasoning can be explained through that metaphor, which
Mhm.
just because has been mentioned a couple of times, so I thought
Yeah.
you'd be the best person to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, there's two parts to an iceberg. In a sense, you have the part that's above the surface of the water, and then you have the remainder, which is beneath the water. And so the metaphor, how it applies is you can think of the tip of the iceberg as the empirical reality. That's the reality that is easily measurable and countable, describable. We can see it. A group of scientists can look at a phenomenon and come to some consensus about what is going on because they can describe it, they can count, there's and ease to that. Then there is a deeper reality which is exists, which serves to explain the existence of the empirical, and that deeper reality is where we find the mechanisms. Now, the challenge is that if mechanisms are less observable, they're less describable, and we can't quantify them. In other words, you can't easily get a strength of evidence type of data set around the mechanisms. Then what does that mean for research? What does that mean for doing rigorous research? And this is a paradox, something that we need to grapple with, that sometimes the most important aspects to what we're studying are also those aspects that are the most difficult to evaluate, to understand. But we don't want to ignore them because they're difficult to measure or describe. And this comes to a critique that the realist approach has with other approaches. And Ray Poston has said it in his own way, and other people say it. But the critique is that if you prioritize that which is measurable and countable, yes, you have a sort of in a sense a stronger kind of evidence base, and you're not working with this more conjectural, hunch-driven, creative theorizing around the deeper aspects, but you're also potentially missing the important causal understanding that explains that manifestation. And we know that, with the iceberg, and you know what happened to the Titanic, right? And it's dangerous. It's dangerous to not look beneath the surface, because when you just look at the surface, when you just look at the empirical, it gives you a certain optical illusion of what the reality is, which is not aligned to the actual reality. So that's a realist way of thinking. We try to apply that to research, and then the conversation gets very interesting.
Certainly, and I could speak to you all day about this, Justin. And hearing you speak, you make so much sense, and the metaphors that you use and the explanations are very clear. But I'm sure that over your time and your progress in the realist world and speaking to so many people and seeing so many different projects, when people are trying to do and put into practice this retroductive reasoning to go into more explanation and to go beneath the surface of that iceberg, you may have seen some misunderstandings or some errors in the practice of actually going through the retroductive reasoning. So what are some of the most common that you've seen that researchers should look out for?
Well, when I think about misunderstandings in relation to retroduction, well, there are a few things. I think certainly that when people have been trained in other approaches, moving to the realist approach can be a paradigm shift that requires some effort. And there may be some questions, some resistances. People, in some cases, say if you're a person who's really developed a lot of skill and a lot of success in working with effectiveness type research. So positivistic research that seeks to understand the effectiveness of programs through randomized controlled trials. It, there is definitely a place for that, and in some cases, a primary place for questions of effectiveness. Does the intervention work or not? I remember many years ago, I had a trainee come to my workshops, one of my workshops, and she said, my supervisor sent me, and so on one of the days of the workshop, said, Justin, what you're saying is interesting, and I was relaying some of this back to my supervisor, and my supervisor said the following. My supervisor said, I don't really care to know why something works or how it works. I just want to know that it works. Because if we know that it works, then we can scale it up. We can go forward with it. Then the how and the why is more like just sort of like the icing on the cake. It's like if we have time, we can ask the how and the why, and so she proposed that to me. So what's your reaction to that? And that is just an example of how we are in research. We do work in different paradigms with different priorities. So I think there's for some people, maybe there's a lack of recognition of the potential value of the retroductive approach. Now, realists will challenge this idea that, we don't really need to know how and why. That's superfluous. We need just to know if it's effective, if it works. Because the realists will say, myself included, will say that in order to understand if it works, we need to have a starting point where we assume that the intervention will work differently in different geographical contexts for different demographics at different time points. And then there will be variations to the program's architecture over time that need to be understood. All of that differential kind of understanding is important because in fact, interventions are not monolithic structures. They're not two-dimensional, static, monolithic. They're dynamic, changing with variations, and variations can be informal, so they can start to evolve and adapt to circumstance. So all of that, in a way, challenges the questions of whether you can even get a clear effectiveness result in the first place. And so those debates are worth having, and it's possible that there's also a fit for purpose question. In some research areas, the effectiveness question is actually very important and perhaps the primary, the way forward. But in many others, especially with complex social interventions, working with vulnerable groups and so on, the realist approach has a lot of benefit, and that's why more and more people are, coming into the realist way of thinking about it.
Certainly,
Yeah.
many are, and also the number of publications and the funding streams and everything else that is coming towards it. There certainly is a push towards realist thinking, and you make such a compelling case and some a compelling understanding to understand what's going on behind the curtain, so to speak, in a theater metaphor as well. But then you may have someone come to you, Justin, to say, "Okay, Justin, that makes sense. I understand what." Retroduction is and I can see why I need to do it, but how do you actually do it in practice? Because theoretically, it may be very compelling, but then in practice, it can be quite an intellectually demanding task trying to unearth these
Mhm.
mechanisms that you mentioned are hidden or latent or difficult to capture in the naked eye. So, what's your personal process or routine
Mhm.
when engaging with this reproductive process? How does one go on to do it?
Well, that's a very good question. Now, if you are evaluating a program, a service, an intervention, or a policy, then your approach to retroductive inference will be different than if you are applying a retroductive way of thinking to a more kind of open system phenomenon, right? With programs and services and interventions, they all have efforts that are being implemented in contexts. So the first step to understand the how and the why is to understand what is going on. So the first step is a descriptive step. We need to have some understanding of the boundaries and the contours of the program's architecture. So I use this concept program architecture to help in understanding. Again, it's going back to this idea that programs are not this monolithic, singular entity. Programs have many components and a lot of detail. Or detail right down to, social, individual communicative gestures. It could be very specific kind of details. So if we gain a vision of the architecture, in other words, the form, and the architecture includes the form and the function of interventions. But we start with the form. That's descriptive. Once we get a clear understanding of the descriptive parts, then we can move into the how and the why. So we can move into the causal question. So this is what's happening. So how do we assume that to be working? In what way does it work? Why does it work? And then we get program mechanisms. So it's also a part of this is granulating the program's architecture into more and more specific aspects that we can then theorize. And we use program theories, very low to the ground, like hypotheses style program theories, to ascribe a causal functioning to different aspects of the program. That's the process in a nutshell of theory development at the initial stage, and then you proceed to test your theories. So you describe your architecture, you ascribe causal functioning, like you hypothesize causal functioning to all the different macro and micro level efforts, and then you proceed to test those theories with data, which could be qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods to produce your retroductive outcome, your retroductive analysis.
Fantastic,
Yeah.
Justin. Thank you so much for going through that step-by-step process. And I think, as you say, it's probably spending that time in learning about the program or the phenomena and preparing and learning about that program architecture. Because I think it can be very tempting to skip the thinking stage and the planning stage and they're just going straight into that process. But the work that you do at the start to really understand those things can make a big difference at the end, certainly. Have you found, because as you were speaking there, I was trying to, I was thinking around the analytic strategies that you have used in your work to help you with retroductive reasoning, because it is true that we know that realist evaluation and synthesis is method neutral. So, you can use quantitative and qualitative mixed methods to help you refine, refute, or confirm those program theories. But have you found that there are any particular analytical strategies within your work that are more aligned with retroductive reasoning and retroductive thinking?
Well, it depends on how much experience you have with the approach. With every project, and I think most people will probably agree, is that it gets easier over time to engage in a retroductive way of thinking. Initially, it might require more effort, and then over time, it becomes a bit easier because your brain has really been trained to see the mechanisms in a way. And so now I'm at a stage where, if I'm conducting a realist evaluation or a realist synthesis, when I'm reading, I don't need to have my, highlighter pens of this is a context, this is a mechanism, this is an outcome. I can read something and put the paper down and, engage in an appraisal journal, or I write, maybe 200 words on the paper with that retroductive agenda. So, what is it about this paper that is relevant to the review questions, and also where are the mechanisms? How are the mechanisms being engaged with in this paper? Now, there is a risk, over time as we work in the realist approach, that we come very comfortable with a certain kind of set of ideas around the how and the why, and we get fixated on those. And you talk about misunderstandings. There's also pitfalls. And the pitfall has to do with kind of relying on a certain kind of set of safe mechanisms that are very well understood versus kind of breaking new ground and keeping things fresh, keeping your mind open, making sure that your biases are not creeping in and just filling in the gaps with things that are not really aligned with what's actually going on in the world and in the areas that you're studying. Necessarily probably don't have time to go into great detail about that, but one of the observations I've had is that there is a risk that if you don't kind of keep things open and look for the mechanisms in an original way for your studies, you could end up recycling the same kinds of mechanisms over time. Like trust is an example, of a mechanism, like the way people trust each other in interventions. It's become very, very popular, very ubiquitous type of mechanism. And it's fine, it's absolutely fine, but does it lead to pragmatic innovation? So if you make a conclusion at the end of your research that, we've established that it's very important that the service user trusts the service provider in the intervention. Well, that's pretty well established already. But the question is, what is it about this intervention that fosters trust? And what are the unique factors of a person's context that might impede a trusting response, even in the efforts that are trying to create a safe space and so on. So the granulation in is where we need to keep things fresh and keep things relevant to specific projects because trust is a mechanism at the middle range. We can think of just trust as a mechanism, but specifically that will take on different forms for different projects that are embedded in different circumstances and working with different people and so on. So we have to get to that level. Now, how you do that is the bigger question. We can talk about that, if you like. Let me put it back to you. What do you say to what I've just said?
I'd say please go along and tell us how we do that, because it's certainly an area that's so important. And I love what you're saying, Justin, here about not becoming complacent when you've done so many maybe of the studies, and your thinking starts becoming more realist and retroductive, to take each project as a blank canvas. But within that blank canvas, what you have is the brushes and the tools to help you build that
Mhm.
picture. But you certainly have to have that creative and exploratory nature into that perspective, as you say, because it becomes more linear, and that's a risk towards more realist ways of,
Mhm.
of thinking. But please do carry on and say around the how process that you mentioned.
Well, that I mean, there has been some work done looking at how to optimize the potential of the realist approach. And this question of, is realist evaluation, really optimizing its potential? Are we really getting where we need to go? And so there is a risk that some realist outputs become banal. They're not, but at the same time, sometimes that's what the field needs. So sometimes the audience needs a very basic kind of concept, like trust as a mechanism. But then does it inform pragmatic innovation? Now I'm kind of skirting around your actual question, but let me address your actual question. So if you want to really understand how you analyze data with a retroductive lens, then first of all, there's no specific protocol. So there's no one way to do it. So in other words, there's no like formula, right? And we have to find our own path through it. And in that, you can use very structured approaches. You can use a code book or a coding structure that gives you something to lean on and force you. So if you're a novice, you could create a data extraction sheet that forces you to answer questions like, does this paper have mechanisms? And so then it kind of forces you to go back to the paper and read it really carefully. Do I see a mechanism here? Or do I see a context mechanism connection here? And so that's retroductive, right? So it's in the phrasing, right, of your analytical questions that will train you to get to that place of retroductive analysis. What is it about this program that is explaining the functioning? How does it work? You can add those to your data extraction sheets. Now, once you become more seasoned, you might engage in a less structured journal, which allows you to really kind of incorporate your broader thinking along with the content of the data that you're reading to to explore and to fill in gaps with theoretical understanding. So that's kind of my answer for, I don't know. Does that give you clarity, Alejandro?
Well, certainly. I think you gave some really good tools and approaches, particularly as you say that there's no recipe. It's not like a cookbook
Yeah.
when it comes to there's more it's more of a I see the reproductive reason as a way of thinking rather than a formula, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
and I
Hmm.
think that's also for individuals who are just starting, that can be quite scary sometimes to think, oh, how do I follow this? But at the same time, embracing that complexity and process, you can also make it very, very clear. And I think as long as you're justifying and being transparent in the decisions and thinking in that retroductive way, that probably is a good starting point as you're going through your data analysis from retroduction. I love hearing you speak and just explain the different examples and metaphors and also debates. I think it's important to put into place the current debates that do happen in the realist world, to really get listeners to understand not only where we are but where we're going and where we could
Hmm.
potentially go, because I think that's how it will certainly develop. As I think and I hear you speak, Justin, you have so many different points and wisdom and tips that I want to challenge you now to pick your top three. Because in this podcast, we like always to end with three practical tips for people to live. And for the topic of today, with retroductive reasoning, if someone is listening to this podcast and they're either starting in their retroductive reasoning or they're trying to get to grips with this concept, they're trying to maybe do it for the first time as they're analyzing their data, or indeed want to understand it a bit more, what would be your top three tips for someone as they live this podcast to get a little bit better at retroductive reasoning?
Okay, so I think my first tip would be to take small steps in the process, baby steps. Don't feel anxious about not having clarity of the whole process all at once. It's nice to gain some, sketched out vision, but your protocol or your approach will emerge over time. So if you start with the very first step of establishing your research questions in a retroductive way, so you're asking the how and the why questions, phrasing your review or your evaluation questions with retroduction, that's that's step one. And then if you start to sketch out some if-then statements that help you unpack the causal thinking around your program, even in a really rough format. Don't worry about making it perfect, right? That those small steps, every step of the way, you gain more clarity. And so that's the first recommendation is baby steps along the path and have faith in the process, right? Now, the second piece of advice I would give is iteration. So expect that you're going to assume that, you're going to do it in certain way, but as you proceed, you might, um, uh, you know, reverse your steps and try again. So piloting out your, if you're doing a realist synthesis, like piloting your search strategy to test out your approach and then going back to the drawing board, trying again. So this iterative, like non-linear approach to the research is important because it is exploratory. And as you proceed down the path, every step of the way you learn. You're learning through your retroductive lens, you're learning. And those learnings may steer your research in different directions, even midway through. So it's not that you're going to have a very strict protocol at the start of your work and then stick to that with a very rigid kind of adherence. There is a flexibility and an adaptability here, and where you end up at the end might not be where you thought you would be. But that's part of the process because we are working in those deeper waters. We're working with the deeper insights that you just don't know at the start, and that might take you somewhere that you didn't realize you were going to go. And that might be very, very valuable for the field. And then the third piece of advice is to apply retroductive thinking at every step of the process, from establishing your review questions to formulating your initial program theories to developing your protocol for collecting your data to actually collecting your data. So, in qualitative interviewing, you can engage with retroduction with your interviewees or with your stakeholder groups. Then when you're in analysis, you're also engaged in retroduction. So retroduction is not something that just happens in the analysis of your data. Retroduction is a lens, like you said, a way of thinking that applies across all stages of your research. So those are my three baby steps: commit to an iterative approach and apply retroductive thinking in every stage along the process.
Justin, I had just noted them down to summarize them, but you've done that very nicely for me already. So that is great, and I can so relate to that as you mentioned, and to embrace that way of thinking as a very stimulating way as well to try and find those at least shed some light into the process or into the phenomena that you're interested in. Justin, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you in. Thank you so much for all your time, for your thoughts, for your comments, and for your examples. I think they've been extremely useful. And for anyone else listening, thank you so much for joining another episode of the Realist Lens. And I will see you very soon. Justin, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Alejandro. Thanks for the invitation. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.